Hello everyone. This is our second video in our continuing series of the Ten Commandments Bible study. Today we're looking at commandment number 6, thou shalt not commit adultery. Now before you ask the children to leave the room or be worried that there's going to be a lot of suggestive comments in this video, you don't need to worry. This is actually a problem with discussing this commandment that we run into whenever this topic is brought up. In our society today, we have taken the word adultery and have turned it into a one meaning only word. When in fact, if you look at the history of Judaism and how this word was used back then in the Old Testament especially, you'll see that the word adultery, or as we say in Jewish, na'af, is not just form of sexual use. The word adultery is actually very, very specific in its usage in the Old Testament. And what's interesting is that it's the only word used for adultery in the Old Testament. And it actually implies of a verb and a noun. So but let's begin. The word na'af in Jewish means actually to commit adultery. Now, we can start in the Exodus with 10 commandments. This commandment, like the previous one on thou shalt not murder, this commandment also is just two words. There's no subject and there's no other. The English, we filled in the words. By the tenses of the Hebrew word, we know that it's talking about pointing to us and the act of committing adultery. Adultery is not a noun, it's a verb. So we kind of goofed it up in our English when we say that someone commits adultery. In the Jewish form, it's actually a verb, which means you are doing adultery. Adultery is an active word, and it's not a noun passive word as we tend to think in English. So what does that mean then? It means then that when God said, thou shalt not commit adultery, he's actually saying, do not do the act of itself. It's not an act that stands alone. It's an act that's actually in action as it proceeds. So what happens is that when you look at the requirements in the book of Leviticus, you could turn to the book of Leviticus, chapter 20, and especially verse 10. If you look at Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10, it gives in there the list of laws which pertain to keeping yourself holy. It's part of what we call, in the bigger sense of that section in Leviticus, the holiness codes. The holiness codes are a set of specific laws that were given to the Israelites in order to keep themselves pure so that they are able to go to the temple to worship. Hence, that's why they're called the holiness codes. And it's interesting to note that when they talk about adultery, adultery has a very specific description in that the committal of adultery is between a man and a married woman. And that is the specific definition for adultery in the biblical times, especially in the Old Testament. It was between a man, and it doesn't say if the man is married or not. He could be married or single, with a married woman. Because if you reversed it, if, say, the man was married and it was with a single woman, then that they actually consider fornication or even prostitution. which in those days prostitution was legal. Because in many of the pagan temples, especially when you get to the Greek and Roman temples, during the days of the influence of Greek culture from 330 BC onward through Jesus' time, you will see that a lot of your temples had what they call temple prostitutes, both female and male. And part of their worship was that you would hire one of these temple prostitutes. So it's interesting to look at when we're defining adultery, in this case, in the case of the Ten Commandment, they're specifically looking at a man with a married woman. Because the punishment for that, as according to Leviticus chapter 20, is that both the man and the married woman would be taken out and stoned to death. Nothing against the married woman's husband, but just the married woman and the man. They would be taken out and stoned to death. Now, this sounds very familiar because when we fast forward into the time of Islam, with the writing of the Quran, and even today's usage, there are many places around the world that still adhere to this ruling. You will see this ruling actually being applied in places such as Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, anywhere where they still use the Sharia law of the Quran, is that if a woman is caught in adultery, she is stoned to death. And unfortunately, it still happens even today. So let's backtrack then. So adultery is between a man and a married woman. But if it was a married man with a single woman, then it's called fornication or prostitution. And we can safely say this because if you look in your Bible, go ahead and look at Proverbs chapter 7. In Proverbs chapter 7, we read about wisdom. And wisdom warns about the prostitution. She said that prostitution is like a woman. She's a married woman whose husband has gone away on a long trip with a bag of money. And she's calling to the men on the street, calling them in, saying, "Come, I have perfumed my bed with spices. I have put on my best attire. I have bathed in roses. Come, let us spend and make love all night long and all day, for my husband will not return." Proverbs chapter 7 says to beware of such people, to beware of the guile and the trap that they set, for they will surely ensnare you and never let you go. And so we look at the social outcome of adultery. And as we look through the Old Testament, we can see this happening with many of the characters of the Old Testament. Probably the most famous one that everybody knows is David and Bathsheba. When King David did not go off to fight in the spring with the armies, but instead stayed behind in Jerusalem, and he happened to be walking on his roof one night and saw Bathsheba doing the ritual purifying baths on the roof over in the next area. Of course, we know what happened with the story is that Bathsheba was a married woman. And here is where it's interesting to note. By Jewish law, King David and Bathsheba should have been stoned to death because she bore a son. And so they could not hide the fact that this was David's child. This proved that this adulterous relationship happened. But in the story, who actually died? Besides the baby later on. It was actually her husband, Uriah the Hittite. David compounded his sin of adultery by then breaking the previous commandment, "Thou shalt not murder," to try to cover up his sin of his adultery. He went and then had Uriah the Hittite accidentally murdered in combat. So instead of he and Bathsheba suffering the penalty, according to the Jewish law in Leviticus, it was Uriah who suffered the penalty. And then later, the child, the offspring of this adulterous relationship, died too then from disease. And so we see how adultery can affect a family's relationship. And in fact, another good example is the book of Hosea, one of the minor Old Testament prophets. The book of Hosea. God orders Hosea to take a prostitute for a wife because God is showing Israel, and this is including Judah, God wants to show to them how much his relationship to Israel was like a man who took a prostitute. She could not quit playing the harlot and kept running after other men, while Hosea remained faithful. She would come back and be devastated. Hosea would take her back, but then as soon as she was better, she left again to go play the harlot, as the book of Hosea said. And so God, over and over in the book of Hosea, in the book of Jeremiah, in Isaiah, over and over, God uses this language expression of, I was the one whom you played the harlot with, for you were not faithful to me. You ran after the strange gods, entertaining yourself while I was your faithful husband, sitting here waiting for your return. And finally, at the end, he says, basically in the prophecies, O Israel, what have I done to you to deserve such this? What is it I have done? What more could I have done to keep you faithful to me? I've sent you the prophets. I've sent others to warn you about these foreign gods and people, and yet you are still unfaithful. Therefore, you are the ones who have broken my covenant, not I. Because it's interesting, because the writers would say that the people of Israel would say, well, where is God? How can God blame us for these catastrophes? And so you see this back and forth relationship. God is using the analogy of him being the faithful husband in this marriage, and Israel being the unfaithful one, the one who is committing the adultery. Because here you see, according to the commandment, Israel was married to God in a relationship. And so according to the commandment of thou shalt not commit adultery, this was the foreign people were the single man having an adulterous relationship with Israel, who is the bride married to the bridegroom or God. So God uses that analogy of the adulterous relationship as a breaking of his own commandment. And this is important because, as we said before, God told them with the giving of these 10 commandments, if you abide by these commandments, you shall live long and prosper in the land that I am giving you. And so God based their living in the land that God gave to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, based on keeping these 10 commandments. And yet this number 6, you shall not commit adultery, God had taken it from just being about a marriage relationship between a man and a woman and someone else into something much bigger. He's comparing his own relationship with Israel as a marriage relationship. And as Israel goes to play the harlot, as he says, with the other nations, with other gods, forsaking her own husband with the promise That is how God justifies then, with Israel being destroyed, and then later Judah, and then sent into exile in Babylon. It's a beautiful concept that God uses with this covenant and this commandment. Now, let us backtrack to the original point, which a lot of people think this commandment is about, more of a physical nature between men and women. In the Garden of Eden, when God created them in the first chapter of Genesis, God said, now let us make humankind in our own image. And he did. He made male and female and placed them in the garden. He made the two together. And this is the first story of the chapter of creation. He made the two together, male and female. And then he said, let no man tear asunder what God has put together. Male and female need each other. It is not a competition. It's a cooperation. There are things that men can do that females can't. And there are things that females can do that men can't. And that's not trying to be unpolitically correct either. It is a fact of life. And it takes two together, working in cooperation with one another, to create a perfect relationship. Now, unfortunately, due to our sinful nature and our brokenness, this is not always the case. In fact, by today's statistics, it says that between 20 to 40% of all married men will have an affair at least once in their marriage, and 20 to 25% of all females will have an affair during their marriage. Over 1/4 of all marriages will have an adulterous relationship at least once. So what does that mean then? What happens is, as Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5 through chapter 7, when Jesus talks about, you have heard it said, thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say to you, even anyone who looks with lust in his heart upon somebody has already committed adultery. Even someone who thinks about another person has committed adultery already in their heart. God is telling us that what comes out of our heart is more important. And when we are not faithful to our spouses and to our partners, it is because deep within our heart, we truly do not show the love that we need. And where our heart is where our treasure is also. And so if we feel that our needs are not being met and we start looking around at other people, maybe we need to reevaluate to ourselves what the issue is. Is it trying to satisfy our own need? Or are we actually looking at complementing one another in a relationship? Some people say that relationships are 50-50%. But in actuality, relationships are 100%, 100% together. It's not a 50-50 because then that means you are not giving your all into the relationship, but instead it's a 100 to 100 relationship. And here becomes then a fine point that we need to remember when Jesus is talking about adultery. Adultery and divorce are two separate things. A couple can have an adulterous relationship, but it might not end in divorce. The couple might reconcile. When it gets to the point of a divorce, that means the brokenness is completed. Each partner feels that there is no hope to restore the relationship. and so they terminate it. And this, in the Bible, Jesus said Moses was the one who gave you that option. When God wrote the Ten Commandments, he said, "You shall not commit adultery." It was Moses who gave the discourse of the certificate of divorce, because Jesus said, because of your sinful nature. Because when a partnership like a marriage dies, it's almost like you've killed a relationship. The trust is broken completely. And unfortunately, it's a reality in our sinful world. There are times when divorce might be necessary. And it's also considered very evil sometimes if we try to force people to stay together that are the victims of domestic violence, drug abuse, or other things such as that.